My name is Timothy Wise. I'm the Research and Policy Director at the Global Development Environment Institute. Today we award the Leontief Prize for advancing the frontiers of economic thought to Peter Timmer and to Michael Lipton. I'm here now with Michael Lipton to talk to him about some of the main points that he raises in his Leontief lecture. Michael, you've made it your life's work to really examine the role of smallholders in agricultural development, and not just in agricultural development, but really in national economic development. Why the emphasis on smallholders?
Well, first of all, you start where you are. If you start in a poor, low-income country, typically something like 7 in 10 of the workers and their families, the people and their families at work, have as the main source of their income farming, and the great majority of those are family farmers and smallholders. In Latin America particularly, quite a lot of them also work on big farms, but in Africa and Asia the great majority of people are smallholders, so that's where you start from. Now, the development process consists in the long run of moving to higher income occupations, becoming less dependent on agriculture. But to start that process off, it's been found in the almost universal experience of developing countries, you have to get agriculture moving first. And quite surprisingly to many people, it turns out that the most socially efficient way of doing that is concentration on the smallholder sector. And the reason for that is that in developing countries where there's lots of labour, lots of people on the land, rather little savings and capital, it matters much more to use your labour effectively than the capital, because you have hardly any capital apart from what labour makes itself, sweat capital. Now, small family farmers have very low costs in supervising their workforce because they are their workforce. Whereas large farmers who have to supervise workers over a big space, often people they've never seen before, have high, what economists call transactions costs of labour management. So that almost all the studies show that in this situation, it is the small farmer who gets more output per hectare or output per acre than the large farmer over the year. So that the small farmer, it's not that the large farmer is inefficient, not at all. They're both doing what makes sense for them, but the large farmer has to worry about saving labour because the transactions costs are so high. The small farmer doesn't have to worry about that nearly so much. So that small farm development is a cost-effective way forward in poor, low-income, high-labour countries. And there are now many hundred studies all pointing in this rather surprising direction. The large, shiny farm with combines is a no-no where capital is scarce and labour is plentiful. What you really want are efficient smallholdings. And the experience of the Asian Green Revolution is that it's smallholders, people usually under 2 hectares, who have carried the great thrust forward of the Green Revolution to success. And so you have a win-win situation. Development is very often about conflicts between growth and equality and poverty reduction. But here the two go together. Growth focusing on the smallholder is both efficient growth and good for bringing forward the poor and not increasing in income inequality. So naturally that is a sound basis for development, and I've got more and more concerned with getting that emphasis right.
Well, is that why you stress in your Leontief talk the importance of what you call increasing the levels of income from work?
Income from work, yes. Work is what the poor have to sell. They also quite often have a little bit of land and they can put their work to use on their own land. Where they don't, in those developing countries where you start with extreme land inequality, e.g. South Africa, you usually have to start with a land reform. And there have been many successful examples of that in Asia, some in Latin America. It's actually got a far better track record than you'll read in the textbooks, for reasons I can go into. So in some countries you have to start with a land reform. In many countries, in sub-Saharan Africa in particular, you have got fairly equal land to begin with. But if you start with fairly equal land, the smallholder with proper backing from farm science, and I underline that, and with control over water and control over plant nutrients, the smallholder is a tremendous vehicle for efficient growth, as well as for getting himself or herself and the family out of poverty.
But it sounds like it requires a significant role for the public sector in helping provide that technology and that control of water, control of resources.
That's usually the case. Some of these things can be done by the private sector. If the groundwater is not too far from the surface, the small farmer in the slack season has the spare labour under her own supervision and control to dig that well and then to maintain the field channels. So the private sector can do quite a lot. But there are some things with large gravity flow irrigation systems particularly, which are very important, with getting the rural roads to provide the fertiliser, with getting the information and the science to the farmer, first by generating science for smallholders, which doesn't usually pay private research, and then for getting that information through extension systems to the smallholder. These things are more effectively done and sometimes will only be done by the public sector, yes.
Yeah, it's striking that in your Leontief talk you sound cautiously optimistic, dare I say, about African agriculture. I'm struck that you talk about the need for policies that can give Africa what you call provocatively, quote unquote, a good crisis.
Yes.
To have a good crisis. What is a good crisis?
Well,
and what policies are needed to really...
Well, I think we need to go back to what the crisis is. A crisis means a situation where things either get sharply better or sharply worse. Now, between now, 2012, and 2050, the labour force, the population aged 15 to 64 in the majority of sub-Saharan Africa, I exclude South Africa, but the bulk, what I call the short Africa, real sub-Saharan Africa, that population of working age is increasing 3.7 times. It's no longer the case that Africa is a continent of ample, spare, empty land. 50 years ago that was so, but due to population growth mainly, most of the decent land has been occupied. In fact, it's been overcropped, overfarmed, and land is being planted, for example, to maize that can only sustain grazing. So it has to be a question of how to intensify that land use. So the crisis is rapidly growing workforce needing jobs and incomes on the one hand, and a quantity of land which has not been very much intensified in farming, very little irrigation, very, very low levels of fertilizer application, 6 kilograms of main plant nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potash per hectare. In India, it's now about 150. In China, it's 200. And that's because when you've got water control, the farmer is prepared to apply these. So you have this collision of a steadily growing workforce with a land base, and I could add a water base, that is not rising either in quantity or in quality nearly sufficiently to support that. Now, you say I'm optimistic, it's because this is a great opportunity. If you have more workers per dependent, and that's what's happening, these young people whose lives have been saved by less dysentery, slightly better nutrition, some malaria control, more and more people are growing up. Fertility is falling slightly, not nearly as fast as it did in Asia, but somewhat. And as a result, there are more workers per head of population. Now in Asia, that accounted for 1/3 of the miracle of growth acceleration. This is a great opportunity. But if that population does not find productive employment, it will be a disaster, not an opportunity, but a cause of crisis going bad, going the wrong way. So there's a great opportunity here to use this improvement in the structure of the population, more workers relative to dependence, in order to generate a green revolution, or a series of different green revolutions specific to the requirements of different parts of sub-Saharan Africa. A great opportunity, and we know it can be done. But there are preconditions concerned with public and social management of the soil-water complex.
We noted in our recent food crisis report that it's definitely stimulated a shift in the debate over the role of smallholders in development, over their importance. But Do you see the kinds of shifts that you think need to happen in public policy in Africa?
Well, there are some countries where the answer is clearly yes. Rwanda is an example. Ghana is another example. Possibly Burkina. There are a few countries where there clearly has been a major shift of public policy in that direction. But unfortunately there are several countries, and particularly large African countries, where the political leadership is genuinely unconvinced of the case for smallholding. It's denigrated, it's called scratch-a-patch, sub-subsistence, sub-family farming, all sorts of rude words are used about these people. And these people genuinely mean it. I mean, if you see a, quote, modern farm with every modern convenience, every possible bit of machinery, churning up the land, I mean, it just looks more like real modern farming than the smallholder with many crops in one field, very little apparent support. The fact that the smallholder is actually making more cost-effective use of the resources available to him, it's clear when you do the sums, but it's not clear when you just use your eyes. And especially if you and your family come from a relatively large farming background, or have been to the United States or the UK and seen big farms there. And in our countries, big farms are more successful because we're capital intensive, and when you're capital intensive, large farm size pays. But you see that, you don't see the hidden advantages. You do if you've been to Taiwan or to the Indian Punjab, but if you haven't, you see these things, and by eye evidence, you form an incorrect and prejudiced judgment against the smallholder. And I think, I'm afraid, there is still a lot of that around in sub-Saharan Africa at quite high political and even research level. Yes, it's a problem.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for being one of this year's Leontief Prize winners for the Global Development and Environment Institute.
Thank you very much for awarding this to me.